Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're just connecting our streaming feeds and we will get started momentarily. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we're all connected. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sophia Nehlawi, Adult Services Associate at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Writers Live with Jabari Asim, joined in conversation with Rihanna Milkar Scott. All Pratt Library locations across the city are now officially open again at 100% capacity. Please stop into your closest neighborhood branch to check out all of our latest offerings. And so now, tonight's speakers. Jabari Asim is a writer and multidisciplinary artist. He directs the MFA program in creative writing at Emerson College, where he is also the Elma Lewis Distinguished Fellow in Social Justice. His nonfiction books include The N-Word, Who Can Say It, Who Shouldn't, and Why, What Obama Means for Our Culture, Our Politics, Our Future, Not Guilty, 12 Black Men Speak Out on Law, Justice, and Life, and We Can't Breathe on Black Lives, White Lives, and the Art of Survival. His books for children include Whose Toes Are Those? And Preaching to the Chickens, the story of young John Lewis. His works of fiction include A Taste of Honey and Only the Strong. Rihanna Milkar Scott is the author of the story collections The World Doesn't Require You and Insurrections, which was awarded the 2017 Penn Bingham Prize for Debut Fiction and the 2017 Hillsdale Award from the Fellowship of Southern Writers. He teaches creative writing at the University of Maryland. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Kenyon Review, Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, and Crab Orchard Review, among other publications. And so now, without further ado, please welcome Jabari Asim and Rihanna Milkar Scott.
Thank you, Sophia. Thanks for that very nice introduction. Hey, Rihanna.
Hey, how you doing? Thank you, Sophia. Oh man, I can't wait to get into this. To say that I love this book is an understatement. Um, but before we get into that, I think I would love for the audience to get a taste of it.
Yeah, sure thing. So what I'll do is I'll read from three short passages. I think together it might be 10 minutes. The book, we'll get into this, but the book has multiple narrators. So two of the passages I will read will be narrated by a character named Cato. And then there are also passages in the book that have a omniscient third person narrator. So the third section I'll read will be one of those. So the first two are from Cato's point of view. And I should say that these characters are captives of a man named Green, Cannonball Green. So there may be some references to him and maybe some other characters, which I can explain. Green allowed us to keep company whenever it didn't inconvenience him. With his permission, I endeavored to make Iris a stool from leftover wood. She had developed a habit of sitting on the humble stoop in front of her cabin at Two Forks and resting on cool evenings. Although I revered the ground she sat upon, I deemed it unworthy of her touch. Nothing cheered me more than seeing her perched on that stool as I approached. At the time, I knew nothing of queens, of royal figures perched regally on thrones, but I knew that my Iris possessed nobility that far surpassed her lowly surroundings. I would sit at her feet grateful for the simple gift of her attention until we entered her cabin. Once, when we were reclining comfortably in each other's arms, I asked her to name her favorite color. Whatever color you are, she said. Iris, tell me, your favorite color. Describe it to me. I'd say you're about the same as polished walnut. I saw you rubbing that stool you'd made me. You insisted on making it gleam before I could sit down on it. I remember you with that cloth, rubbing. I couldn't tell where your hand ended and the wood began. Polished walnut. Iris, just tell me. She rolled over and faced me. Cato, you're my favorite, and that's as far as I go with it. Declaring my fondness for things means I got to feel the hurt when they're taken away. Nothing good lasts. I'm going to last, I told her. I swear it on my 7 words. Good, she said, grinning again. The only thing I've let my heart linger on is you. That wasn't completely true. She kept mementos of the people she'd lost, a patch of straw from an old hat, a yank of hair from a baby who had been sold. She kept those things in a pouch hanging from a cowhide string around her waist, as was the habit of many stolen women. She never talked much about her departed loves, but I knew they lived in her heart too. After we lay together for the first time, she put stray locks from my beard into her pouch. I found myself grateful that she had made room for me. Nestled against her, I learned more about the 2 children she'd born and lost, about the straw hat her mother took off her head and handed to her before new thieves yanked her away, how Iris wore it until the sun burned through its tattered fringe. Her stammers and pauses showed me how hard it was for her to talk about the people she'd loved and who had loved her. They remained mostly a part of her private self. This next part is Cato in the middle of an ordeal that he has suffered. Rain had been falling for hours. Perhaps fall is too gentle a word. It was the kind of downpour that leaves scars, grooves, and dents in the earth. I shivered in my chains, blinking rapidly as it came down in sheets and pellets. With silent Mary's broth coursing through my innards, I had regained sufficient strength to hold myself in a sitting position, resting my head against the post. I had only to be alive until daybreak, and Green would remove my chains, leaving me bound to him nonetheless. Soaked to the bone, I awaited the dawn while considering the looming paradox of my situation, what little I had to live for. In the distance, the splintered gray boards of our cabins appeared to tremble and dissolve in the wet. The resulting cloud of grayness, murky and unsettled, gradually took on new shapes, outlines of boys and girls. Struck dumb, I watched while they marched down the corridor of the quarters toward me, before veering sharply and proceeding toward the plantation borders. Clad in garments I had never seen, nothing like our sackcloth and threadbare cast-offs, they passed me in shades of gray, nearly close enough to touch. I had thought of my ancestors as ancient, with a history of torment etched on their weathered faces. But these were children, ranging in age from 5 harvests to 15, with gleaming faces and vigorous frames. I didn't understand their youthfulness. I understood only that they had been in the world before I came to it, and that they now belonged to some other place. Occasionally, a boy or girl would pause and look at me, then rejoin the procession without missing a step. They walked unsullied through the mud, as smoothly as if they were gliding on cushions of air. I called to them, but any sound I made was lost in the fury of the gale. Already shivering, I became consumed by a different kind of chill, a peculiar sensation unlike anything I had ever known. I sensed the presence of an energy at work, quick, elusive, and beyond my comprehension. I did infer, however, that submitting to melancholy would undo the labors of those who had come before me, that I had an obligation to resist instead of giving in. I rose unsteadily to my feet, aware of my shackles, but determined to somehow overcome them. My ancestors, so resolute and curiously young, had shown me a glimpse, perhaps, of the end of sorrows. So this last passage involves a woman named Sarah, who is about to be transported from one plantation to another. And she will be in the company of an overseer named Holtzclaw, whom she recognizes is not a virtuous man. Having helped himself to Silent Mary's baked goods without offering Sarah so much as a nibble, Holtzclaw deduced that he had been perhaps too hasty in his consumption. Midpoint between Placid Hall and Two Forks, his stomach had grown angry and demanded relief. He halted the wagon at the side of a tree-lined road, climbed down, and hurried into a thicket of vines. Sarah could see the top of his head as he squatted and grunted. She could also see a rock, substantial yet handy, on the ground between him and the wagon. She studied it, imagining what she could do with it, and calculating the speed and stealth she'd need to cover the distance. Slowly, quietly, she swung her legs over the side of the wagon. Before she could lower her feet to the ground, a flicker of motion in the trees above her head made her pause. She looked up and saw, crouching on a branch, a creature from another world. It rested on one haunch, the other leg fully extended along the length of the branch, with both arms stretched upward and grasping an overhead limb. The being's clothes were made to resemble bark, enabling it to blend almost seamlessly against its background. Most striking was its face in broad strokes of brown and green, painted so closely together that no flesh showed. Was it a haint? An angel? Sarah was too awestruck to hazard a guess. Without losing balance, the creature folded an elegant arm and placed a finger to its lips. Sarah nearly gasped when the creature leaped and landed gracefully on silent feet. It squatted and, securing Sarah's attention, drew in the dirt with its index finger. After making sure Sarah saw the marks it made, it rubbed them away. Quick as death, it scampered up a tree and returned to its perch. His bowels settled, Holtzclaw came back to the wagon and noticed a glow on Sarah's face. He chuckled to himself, concluding that her radiance was a sign of the excitement he assumed he aroused in stolen winches. Sarah lived to experience even more surprises, but none as wondrous as her encounter with the mystical figure that swooped down from the trees. She knew then that she would always remember the angel's marks in the dirt, even if she never learned to make sense of them. The cryptic letters burned in her memory as if they had been written in flames. In due time, the words read. I'll stop there.
All right. Yeah, I remember I had a professor one time who said when he wrote one of his books that he just knew he was on, right? He just knew he was on his book, you know. So I when I'm reading this, you know, there's this level of assuredness and confidence in the prose, you know. And I imagine you sitting there like I'm on. Did it feel that way? Did the characters kind of just flow out and you know, did it almost seem to write itself?
In some respects, you know, I mean, I'm sure you can relate to this with your own work, but once I get into it, you know, not to sound too mystical about it, but a lot of it involves just listening to the characters and sort of taking dictation, right? They begin to tell you the story, and you want to be open to what it is they're bringing to you. And I was fortunate in this regard that, for the most part, yeah, it was like that. You know, the characters, you know, each character would say, you know, this is how the story went for me. And initially, it wasn't going to be multiple narrators. It was just going to be William's story. But these other characters kept talking and saying, you know, let me tell you my story. Let me tell you how I saw things. So I had to sort of take a step back and think about organizing it around the multiple voices, which I didn't want to do initially. But you know, they were insistent, and I was smart enough to comply.
So, you know, I feel like, you know, this experience of slavery is one that every generation has to redefine, you know, to get deep, because you know, what happened is it feels, you know, so almost unknowable in a lot of ways. So, you know, we attack it from different methods, history and fiction. So where did you, you know, the way you've come at it, to me, it feels very original. Where did you get inspiration for that?
Well, you know, it's like you say, I was very aware of many of the earlier efforts to write about this period in terms of fiction. And I really wanted the book to be in conversation with all those other books that you and I both know. And so I felt an obligation to try to come up with something different, so that I'm just not kind of saying what other people have said, and maybe said, you know, even more eloquently. So I had to find a point of entry for myself. And so one of the things I wanted to do was sort of make sure that the story was fiercely oriented toward the enslaved's point of view, and that the language reflected that. And once I kind of decided that's what I was going to do, that's where I came up with calling the enslaved people stolen, and their captors thieves, right? And once I kind of set up that paradigm, I was able to be consistent with that throughout.
Yeah, the language just seems to be, so interested in calling things as they were in a precise way. When I was growing up, we called enslaved people slaves, right? That's not a precise way to refer to them. The stolen and thieves is even more precise,
Yeah.
And I absolutely love that, and so how did you hit upon that particular concept? Was it just I need to write things and as they are?
Yeah, I don't know. I thought I think about stolen people, stolen land, all these things that people of color often introduce into the conversation when we're talking about the history of the country, right? And so I really wanted the language to reflect that and to sort of never let the reader off the hook in terms of having to acknowledge the origins of this story and how these people got here. It's like that. There's how people in the political discourse try to soften, the horror of the situation. And I wanted to make sure that the language in the novel sort of pushed back against that.
Yeah. So, some would say you're an expert on the N-word. You literally wrote the book on it. I was looking like, who's this young man back here in the back?
I know the ravages of time.
You literally wrote the book, but you're making a very interesting choice in this book. And I think that before I say that, I remember you saying when this book came out, the word is obviously charged and and it can be ugly, but in the hands of I'm not quoting it directly, but you said something to the effect of in the hands of an artist like Richard Pryor, it becomes poetry. Do you remember saying something to that effect?
Yeah. I was kind of responding at the time. There were absolutists who this word has to be banned. It has to be banned, right? Yeah, and so it's not a word that I use in everyday conversation. It's not a word that I would be comfortable using in everyday conversation. But then I thought if we ban the word outright, let me give you one specific example. The NAACP at one point had said they asked the National Recording Arts and Sciences Academy to not make any artist eligible for a Grammy if they use the N-word in their music. And I immediately said, well, that gets rid of Stevie Wonder, who's probably won more Grammys than any individual, because he uses the N-word very effectively on his album Intervisions, right? So it's like if you say under no instances, there are no instances in which this word makes sense. You're removing a lot of amazing art across genres from the canon, and also I don't think that you can effectively critique racism without engaging with the language of racism. I don't think it's possible. And we tiptoe around that all the time. We say, "Oh, he used a racial epithet." I'm the reader who always says, "But what was that epithet? What exactly did he say? Tell me what he said." Right. So there was a specific incident some years ago. I think when I was first thinking about this book, I think it was a New York Jets football player who had left the field, black man, left the field and gone into the stands and scuffled with the audience. And people were condemning him. And he said the reason why he went in is because, he didn't say someone called him a racial epithet, but that's what the news report said. And I was like, I want to know exactly what so infuriated this brother that he left the field, And I think in those instances, it's the language, the N-word is inescapable. It has to be addressed and engaged.
Mm-hmm. And you make a particular choice here. You use the colloquial form for everybody across the board.
Yeah.
The A rather than the hard ER. With some people make a distinction, but you use it across the board. White people say that. The enslaved or the stolen, they say it. Oh, I'm going to use your language. The thieves say it, and the stolen say it. What went into that? What went into that decision?
Yeah, well, a couple things. Only two of the enslaved actually used the language, right? And those two are characters I would argue have internalized white supremacy. And so their language has to reflect that, in some way be distinctive from the other people who never call themselves that, right? But also wanted to poke fun of and push back at this notion that ending it with an A somehow softens the delusional white supremacist sting of it. Because if you look at history, you'll find that the pronunciation with the A was favored by Southern oppressors, by slaveholders, people who owned and operated plantations. They definitely used an A and not ER. And so I wanted the language to be true to that.
Yeah. So this is not a perspective that I share, but I hear it all the time, right? I hear people always saying that we need to leave this this period alone, and I'm sure you've heard it. We need to leave this period. We need to stop writing about it. Stop making movies about it. Here you are. You jump right into it.
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
Well, a couple things. A prominent African American novelist who has written on the period published an essay a few years back in which he said, "Boy, I hope no younger writers who come after me ever write about slavery."
I remember that. American Scholar, right? It was an American Scholar, right?
Yeah. Those stories have been told. And as soon as I read that, it was not on my wish list to write a book set in this period. But as soon as I read that, I was like, oh, now I have to do it. Because you just told me what I shouldn't be doing. That's like, oh, what a provocation that was. And I think it's really disingenuous to ever suggest that African American artists have exhausted the possibilities in terms of telling stories about this. But I don't think we've come close, right? I think that, and I hope that Yonder is just one of many examples in which different artists bring different perspectives to this period and reveal different things about it. I think that happens continuously. Robert Jones Jr.'s The Prophets is a really good example of that, right? Just a really different look at the period, different perspective, telling stories that we may not have considered before. And I think that, each artist who approaches this period, if they're even remotely successful, they come away from it having revealed something new to us. And I don't see other groups of people saying, we've told enough stories about our oppression. In most instances, they're like, we're gonna flood the airwaves with stories of our oppression so that you never forget. And I do not resent them for that. I totally understand that impulse, and it's one that I share.
Yeah. And I would say that one of your great themes is the way Black people love. I think that's across your fiction. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, totally. I'm obsessed with it. I think it's fair to say. I'm a romantic in the conventional sense of the word. I'm very interested in couples and romantic relationships. I like to read about them. I like to talk about them. That is something that fascinates me. And you're right. My novel before this, Only the Strong, is divided into 3 parts, and it's essentially about 3 romantic relationships. The story kind of revolves around that. A Taste of Honey, it ends with the kiss. The book ends with the kiss and a declaration of love. So I think it's fair to say that that's something I'm particularly interested in. And with Yonder, one of the things that I had in my mind while I was writing it was Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, in which he argues that Black people are incapable of genuine romantic attachment and are motivated solely by their animal urges and appetites. And I thought, and this was really influential thinking that helped enable our captors to break up our families, with ease, because presumably we had different ideas about family, if we had any ideas at all. So I wanted to push back against that and not just show romantic love, but love between brothers, love between sisters, just all the different ways that our bonds of affection sustain and motivate us. So yeah, it was really important to me to spend a lot of time with that.
Isn't it crazy how these so-called geniuses got so much wrong, obviously wrong about us?
Yeah. And to me that's further evidence of the need to continue to tell these stories, because we're pushing up against 400 years of deliberate mistruths, and part of our obligation as writers, as artists, is to challenge that.
Yeah. I think of Edward P. Jones. What's the name of his novel?
The Known World.
Known World. I was one of my favorite literary stories. He has a lot of them, but one of my favorite is him talking about how he got all these books on slavery, and then he didn't read any of them. He just made up everything. How'd you approach that challenge?
Yeah, I did some of that too. I remember one time I did a conversation with Edward P. Jones, like you and I are having right now. I remember a guy stood up in the audience and he was kind of indignant, and he was very suspicious. He was like, that story is it sounds very much like my family history, and I'd like to know where you got it. And Edward P. Jones was like, I got it out of here. I made it up, dude. So yeah, I did a lot of making up. I mean, I reread Douglas's 3 memoirs. I read a really important memoir by a man who escaped enslavement named Lewis Clark. That was really influential in the book. And I read a book called, I can't think of the name of it right now, but it's Growing Up in Slavery, which is edited by Yuval Taylor. And I read a book called Forbidden Fruit by Betty Doremus, which is about love stories and the Underground Railroad. So I did, kind of immerse myself in nonfiction treatment of this subject. And then I said, Toni Morrison was talking about Beloved. She said at some point she had to stop researching to give her imagination free reign. So I was conscious of that. I said, okay, I've done enough. Now I need to see if I can imagine this. I need to, get set to work doing that. But I will say, since you mentioned Edward P. Jones and we've been talking about love, there's a section in The Known World. It's maybe 3 sentences. And I've read the book multiple times, but these 3 sentences tear me up every time I read it. And I certainly was thinking about it when I was writing this book. A man he's very attracted to a woman. He has really, warm feelings toward her in the novel, and he wants to give her something, and he has absolutely nothing. He's just got nothing, right? He doesn't even own himself. And he carves her this crude comb out of wood, and he brings it to her, and he hands it to her, and he's very, shy, and he's aware of how simple it is. And he says, it's not much, and she takes it and says, oh, it's the whole world. Right. And every time I read that book and I get to that page, I have to put it down and walk away and just take deep breaths, because I think he encapsulated so much in 3 sentences. And so I wanted to do something similar in Yonder. That was certainly an influence.
Yeah. So I mean, we talked about, you mentioned Morrison and Jones. Those are sort of obvious books that this, your novels in conversation with. What books would we are not so obvious that this book is in conversation?
Well, sometimes they get lost. I don't want to say lost, but they're not talked about as much. But one was Dessa Rose by Shirley Ann Williams. Another one was Property by Valerie Martin. And then there's another, I won't be able to think of it while we're talking. But yeah, I did kind of want to go back and let's see, Black Thunder by Orna Bonton. It's just the, sometimes, and it's no fault of Morrison, but sometimes, we look at Beloved and then we go forward, right? And we kind of forget all the people who did good work before her. And so I want to be in conversation with those books too. And not just Beloved with Morris, but her book of Mercy was definitely an influence too, in terms of the way she structured it. Sometimes it's first person, it's multiple perspectives, and sometimes it's an omniscient third person narrator. So I did kind of study that one to see how she did that once I figured out that was going to be my structure too.
Yeah. So Yeah, you're super prolific. You're super prolific. I was just thinking that when I was a kid, I was reading you in the Washington Post.
Oh man, don't say that. When you were a kid,
Listen,
Rihanna.
man, 13-year-old Rihanna will be like, "Whoa, you talking to Jabari Asim? What do we do? What do we do to get to that point?"
Uh,
And so I've admired you for a long time, but they're probably, I know there's some writers out there, that are thinking, how do I approach this? How do I get that prolific? How do I you know you know knock out these books? They're at a high quality. You knock out a lot of books at a high quality. What's the process?
I don't really stop. I mean, I'm writing all the time. I mean, Joyce Carol Oates has this quote that I will mangle about approaching writing like an athlete approaches his athletic career. It's got to be that serious, and you're constantly
Mhm.
in training. You're constantly doing the work, and that's certainly my approach. And I imagine that I'm an athlete. And I kind of facetiously say that I'm writing these books because I never learned to hit the curveball. Because I really aspired to baseball when I was a kid. And didn't really have it, right? And so I always kind of facetiously say I got to figure out something to do since I'm not going to be a pro ball player. But yeah, it's mainly it's discipline. I'm very disciplined about it. Who is the writer that says you lead a very disciplined life so that you can be violent and original in your work? I can't think of who that is.
Balzac.
Who is it?
Balzac.
Yeah, Balzac. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I read that early on as a young person, and I was like, that's it. That's how I'm gonna do it. So I mean, the sad part of it is I don't really have any hobbies. This is it. I just read and write. It makes me happy, but it's not. I don't do much else.
Oh yeah. So yeah, on that, what's next on that note?
Let's see. I got a couple more books coming out this year. One
Wow.
is a picture book for children called Me and Muhammad Ali.
Hmm.
Comes out from Penguin Random House. Um, when does that come out? That comes out in September. And then I have a middle school nonfiction book coming out. I think it's December, and it's called A Child's Introduction to Jazz. And then I have another children's book coming out, also Viking Penguin Random House, called Wall of Respect. But I'm not sure if that's supposed to come out in late 2023 or early 2024. Not certain. And then I'm doing two nonfiction books for adults for Simon and Schuster. The first is the one I'm working on now. It's a collection of essays, and it's called American Struggle on Race, Culture, and Imagination. So,
Mm.
so covering, it's similar to some of the things that I did in We Can't Breathe, my previous essay collection, but less tied to the headlines than that
Hmm.
book. So it's going to be a little more far-ranging and heavier, heavier in weight, not in theme, in weight. It'll be a bigger book.
Wow. Okay. All right. You don't stop.
No.
A lot of times when one of my favorite names used to disappear from the newspaper, you never hear from him again. So I was like, oh, there goes that guy. Never gonna hear from him again. Then I hear from you, never stop.
Yeah. No, I mean, it was great being at the Washington Post, but I actually, I could focus more on books once I left there. Some of that energy that went into. I used to do a book review every Tuesday in the style section at a Post for a few years, and I did a
Hmm.
column too. So, and I did a column in addition to being an editor. So, kind of getting away from that was actually a good thing because I really could focus on books in a way that I wasn't able to before.
Yeah. This doubling back to Yonder. Well, you write about the brutality. You don't hide the brutality. But I remember telling somebody that I was thinking that there's no book, there's no movie that can depict the actual brutality, because we would turn away. It is some of the things that I read about is a lot of things we put in this book are ugly. The beatings and the brining, It's ugly, but the reality is much uglier. Reality is much uglier. And there's no book that I read that covers that, and no movie that I've seen that can cover that, because we would shudder, we would turn away, we wouldn't accept that. How did you approach, deciding, what level of brutality you're going to address in your book?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, Rihanna, and it's one that my editor and I went back and forth on. And I should point out that my editor on the book was an African American woman, Dawn Davis, who also edited The Known World. So she knows this material as well as I do. So we could have real discussions about how much to include. And an earlier draft actually had a lot more.
Wow.
And she helped me moderate it to a point, because my thing was, if these characters are motivated by a really strong impulse to transcend their circumstances, to get out of hell, so to speak, I really want to show that hell. I really want to show what they're up against. And so I think every instance of brutality that's in the book actually has an origin in an actual incident that happened in real life. I'm trying to think of one that did not, but so for example, one of the characters, Pickled. One of the characters was Pickled. That comes from George Washington. That was one of his favorite methods of disciplining his stolen people. He pickled them, in which person is slashed with a sharp instrument from head to toe, and then immersed in a barrel of brine, so that it gets into all the wounds. And that actually came from George Washington. There's a really good book on George Washington and his treatment of his slaves by Henry Wiencheck. It's called An Imperfect God. So a lot of this stuff is documented. Well, probably all of it's documented somewhere, but so that helped me to anchor each of the incidents in a real life incident, and then let my imagination do the rest. But there were other things that I had come up with that my editor convinced me not to include, because you're walking a fine line. You want to show people how it actually was, but you also don't want them to drop the book and run from the room screaming, right? So it was a challenge.
Yeah. Wow. So has there been any type of response to that, to the violence, or what is the response so far?
Yeah, some people, it hasn't been a lot, but some people have said, "Oh, this is a really brutal book," and I think you don't want to. It's tempting as a writer to respond to reviews, and it's even more tempting now in the internet age. But I don't think it's a good idea. I had my. I don't think you can win. Number one, and number two,
I'm good every day like me. I don't respond, but I'm on Goodreads all the time. I can't.
Oh yeah, I look at them. But no, I'm not. When I was an editor to the Washington Post, an author would be furious when they had a negative review, and they would call me and say, "I want to write a letter," and I would, in most instances, I talked them out of doing that. I said, that's not, you're not going to win any new recruits doing that. And also, I think that I had my say in the book. That's my argument. Right. And it must succeed or fail on its own merits at this point. And I've been fortunate that it's mostly succeeding.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree. So you're from you have a generations of writers in your family now. So are you guys trading manuscripts? How does that work in the family of writers?
Not a whole lot. I mean, like for example, my son, who published a book with Beacon last year, he's giving a talk at Wells College tonight, same time as our talk.
Yeah, I almost went.
but then been like, where's Rihanna? What happened? I've occasionally looked at his stuff. Like I'm looking at his proposal that he's working on now. But the book that he published, I didn't read it before it came out. And then, my wife is a playwright, so she sometimes reads my stuff. And then with Yonder, she didn't read it, but she listened. I would read her passages, say, how's that sound to you? What do you think? And she would give me feedback. When we've always done that. I mean, she's done that through, 20 plus books now. But yeah, we only, I think my kids only share stuff with me when they want to, they're under no pressure, and I don't need to see it. I was happy to just see my son G-Rod's book when it came out. I wanted to read it new and kind of fresh, like somebody, just somebody pulling it off the shelf at a bookstore. And that was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Do we have any questions from the audience? All right. Do you have a favorite character in Yonder? One that was especially easy or natural to write?
I guess if I had to name a favorite character, thank you for the question. Probably there's a character named Little Xander in the novel who's a younger person. He's 15, 16 years old, and he was a lot of. I really enjoyed writing that character, and I really enjoyed. There's a character who's an itinerant preacher named Ransom, who's was a little sardonic, a little sarcastic. I enjoyed writing about him a lot. I guess I enjoyed all of them, but those two in particular stayed with me a lot, I think, and were maybe easier to write. Part of the question was, was it easy or natural to write any of the characters? None of them were especially difficult, but maybe those two were the easiest to kind of like get down on the page.
All right, this is one I'm interested in. How did your writing process change during the pandemic as opposed to before? Did it change at all?
I would say it didn't change at all, because I put in the time, whether it's a pandemic or not. I'm usually going to be where I am right now, having this conversation with you in front of my computer. So I put the time in, and I'm going to do that if I'm physically able to do it. I'm gonna put the time in. So part of my process, I should say, is relaxing. I actually write a lot better if I'm super relaxed. Like if I ball up my fists, like it doesn't work for me. I'm almost sleepy when I start writing. I just kind of melt and kind of really get into a serene groove and go from there. I don't like stress, and so I it doesn't help me write. So in the pandemic, it was almost stress relief to have to come to the work and do the work.
Wow, yeah, the pandemic wrecked me, man. I had a very difficult time getting to the page. So I'm glad to hear that it was for you that it was easy, because it was hard for me. It was very difficult, and for a lot of writers I hear they had that difficulty.
Yeah. It's been like you have. I've had a lot of conversations with my fellow writers about the effect that it's had on them and on us. So yeah, I hear you there.
Yeah. All right. So you write across. That's another question. You write books across all age ranges. Do you have a genre you prefer to write over others?
Well, poetry is my first love. My first publications were all poetry journals and stuff like that. And when I started out, I thought I would write poetry and fiction. I really had no interest in nonfiction when I began, and I kind of stumbled into it. And it's worked out really well, and I actually like it a lot. But, in my 20s, before I published the book, if you'd asked me what I hoped to publish, I would have just said poetry and fiction. Now I'm deep into nonfiction, but at the time I couldn't see it, And then when I became a journalist, I think it became a natural segue. And so I began to publish nonfiction, almost to the extent where and I'm pitching fiction, and my agents kind of having to say, yeah, he writes fiction too, because people would say, is that guy who writes for the Washington Post? And it's like, yeah, but he does this other stuff, so, but that's not something I envisioned when I started.
Yeah. So what's the process like for writing children's books, and how different is it for your adult books?
Oh, that's a great question. The children's books, again, slightly stumbled into them. They kind of arose out of me trying to entertain my own children, who are all grown now. But my wife and I, we have 5 children, and so part of my parenting tasks was getting them to do certain things, like take a bath, put on their pajamas. Rihanna, I know you know about this stuff because I follow you on social media. So I know
Oh yeah. We'll get off of here. I gotta get the pajamas on and lie down with the young.
Yeah. I know you have similar duties. So so some of the early stuff came out of just entertaining them, trying to get them to power down, right, and get ready to relax and stuff like that. And just talking to my wife. My wife had been a professional storyteller and a children's librarian some years ago when we lived in Missouri. And so I would kind of bounce stuff off of her and say, hey, does that kind of sound like a book to you? And she'd be like, yeah, I think so. And so it kind of got started that way. So I kind of go back in time when I write the children's books, and I imagine my child. I have grandchildren now. And I just kind of imagine them and their perspective and what they want to hear, what will make them laugh, what's a way I can sneak in a lesson at the same time, and just kind of work that way.
Yeah. Whose toes are those? A classic in my house.
That's my best known book.
Yeah, I think I'm taking notes here. I think I need to figure out how to do that. Tell these little stories the power this, because my boy needs some powering down at night.
Yeah.
All right, so you said you have several books coming out at the same time soon. Do you write multiple manuscripts at the same time, or do they just happen to line up like that?
No, I definitely write multiple manuscripts at the same time. Yeah, and that way, like if I run out of an idea of the novel I'm working on, I can save it, close it, and then open up the nonfiction manuscript that I'm working on at the same time. Work on that a while, then work on the children's book that I'm working on. So yeah, I actually, it's very helpful to work across the manuscripts. And the other thing I should say about that is I write out of sequence. I outline a lot. So once the outline tells me where the story is going to go, I can write out of sequence. So I do a lot of that, and then later I assemble it, make a manuscript out of it.
So you can just your brain can just shift. Can your brain just shift from poetry to nonfiction to children's work to fiction? Because my brain doesn't do that.
Yeah, it does, but I'm not sure if it's a good thing necessarily. I mean, if you talk to people in my house, they might say, it would be helpful if he could be more focused on one thing. But yeah, I'm kind of scattershot. That is kind of how my brain works, and I'm seldom thinking about like just one thing. To my detriment. I mean, sometimes it's great if you're talking about being prolific, but it might be better sometimes if I could just kind of think about one thing. But I don't have a great attention span, and so that kind of helps me. If I exhaust my attention span on a particular project, that I can open up another file and go, oh, I'm working on this too, and get totally excited about that and stay interested.
Yeah, when I'm writing poetry, I'm writing poetry. When I'm writing fiction, or not even fiction, if I'm writing short story, I'm writing short story. If I'm writing novel, it's just so hard for me to transition between those three things.
Well, several of the short stories in A Taste of Honey, I actually wrote a lot of that book while I was writing the N-word. And it was sort of intentional because the research that I had to do with the N-word was, just immerse myself in a lot of hateful, repugnant stuff. And after I did that for, a few hours, I kind of wanted to like take a shower, right? And so working on the fiction kind of helped me do that. It was like a palate cleanser, and also kind of helped me, enabled me to approach the nonfiction work the next day with sort of renewed vigor as a result of having departed from it and lived in the world of the short stories for a while.
Yeah. Do you ever reread your own books? Do you ever revisit past books and stories and go, I should have written it like this? I want to add to this question, or do you ever go and say, damn, that was good?
I think it's a combination, right? Sometimes you do go back and read something, you go, that was pretty nice. But yeah, I think it's unavoidable to to read it and go, I should have written it like this. I mean, wow, yeah, that happens all the time. Even one of the passages that I read tonight, it's hard for me to read that passage because I'm editing it while I'm reading. I'm like, I should have said this, I should have said that, But one of the great lessons for me was learning to let things go. To say I've done all I can with this. Let's send it to the publisher and see what happens. Because when I first started, I never wanted to let it go. And my wife would say, if you don't plan to finish that book, you should tell people. You could tell me. You could tell the publisher. I'd be like, I feel like I am. I just can't let it go. I just can't let it go. So I've gotten much better about saying, okay, I think this is done. Right.
So what part in Yonder are you like, damn, that's good? Because I said that a lot reading it. So what part did you say, damn, that's good?
There's a part. It's very late in the novel. All I can say is it's a part where a character named Swing Low catches up with a character named Norbrook, and I can't say more about it because it would spoil it for people who haven't read it. But that was pretty satisfying, that section for me.
Man, you speaking of Swing Low, and one question I forgot to ask was about the mythology. Well, the mythology, because you came up with this crazy mythology. Some I recognize, but then even though it's stuff you recognize, it's changed from I never heard the phrase Baba Yalis, but I've heard of the flying black people. Your mythology, I mean, it's just so well imagined, and I understand some of it's completely made up out of your head. How much of it is made up? How much of it is from history, from mythology?
Well, the whole spiritual practice that the Stolen are part of, I made all of that up. I made all that's not based on anything but stuff in my head. The Buba Yalis came from Virginia Hamilton's book, the People Could Fly, and there are other versions of that story, but I think hers was most influential. Song of Solomon, Toni Morrison was certainly influential there. I really like what she did with the mythology in that novel, the myth of the flying Africans. And
that phrase, you pronounce it differently, Baba Yalis. Was that phrase used before? Because
I say Buba Yalis. I made it a noun, but it's actually a chant. In Song of Solomon, when the children are like turning rope and stuff like that. It's something that they say when they're doing rhymes about flying Africans. So I kind of took that and I wanted to deal with seraphim and angels, and I thought, what if there was another way to describe these people in terms of an African American cosmology? So I borrowed that verbiage from Song of Solomon, but the larger story is from Virginia Hamilton.
Yeah, and I think that's well known within African American mythology. Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. Got another question from the audience. What's your number one piece of advice you would tell aspiring writers out there?
Read. Be humble. I mean, the big lesson I learned from one of my mentors early on was to be humble, because I thought I was hot stuff. I thought I was really good, and part of it was I hadn't read critically. And my pivotal moment was that mentor basically spoon feeding me some Richard Wright and saying, young man, you ain't close to this, right? So before you go swaggering around telling everybody you're a writer, let's be realistic about it. Right. Let's be realistic about how far you've developed. And so as I was practicing, I was always comparing my work to, the established masters. And And usually it was really easy for me to say, okay, I can see there's considerable distance between what I've done and what they've done. Let me see how they develop characters. Let me see how they establish a scene. Let me see how they manage the passage of time. All these things, you can kind of educate yourself. You don't have to go to school for any of these things. You just, you just pay attention. And it starts at the library. That's where it started for me, taking out these books and just like dissecting them somewhat aggressively. How did they do this? How did they do that? How did they solve this particular problem? And it made me more confident about my writing, but also more knowledgeable. I could see the progress I had made, right? And it saved me from jumping out there too early and saying, check me out. And there was nothing worthy of being checked out at when I first thought there was. So that was very helpful to me.
Was there a moment where you said I'm gaining on the masters? Did you figure out I'm doing it? I'm there. I can compete with such and such.
Yeah. I think I did have those moments. And when you have those moments and and I was confident because I'd read so much, right? I mean, I was a book critic for most of my life, right? So I was reading all these books. And I was at the point where I said, okay, well, somebody else needs to vet this stuff. I need to start sending it out and see if anybody says, hey, you're right, we could publish this, And when I got to that point, I was vindicated somewhat. I was like, okay, I'm here now, but at the same time, that's not a reason to relax on your laurels, right? It's like, okay, now I'm gonna go even harder, right? And that's the motivation.
And this is the last question from the audience. What's the most influential book you've read when you were young that maybe steered you into writing?
I don't know if there's an influential book. I loved so many of them. I will say there was an influential moment and an influential writer. And I guess that's, I was probably about 20 years old, and that was Gwendolyn Brooks, the poet. Being in the same room with her.
Oh wow. Yeah.
Changed my life. She came to my school. She was there for 3 days. At the end of that 3 days, that's when I knew this is for me. I think seeing a living, breathing Black writer who was accomplished, making a living, leading a fulfilling life was really important for me to see that and to stand next to her, right, and shake her hand and go, oh man. And at that point, I really started practicing because she did talk a lot about practice, right? So I got that from her. Sit down and practice.
Yeah.
And from that day forward, I started.
Yeah. So yeah. And it shows in the book. It shows in the book. So everybody out there, if you have not picked up this book, I would say pick it up ASAP. Hopefully it's soon to win major awards because it's that good. I love it.
Well, you're saying that because we're friends, and I appreciate it. We go back a long way.
So I'm just here to close us out, but I also really want to say thank you, Jabari, for all of your writing advice. If anyone hasn't been taking notes, I don't know what to tell you, but you can rewatch the program later to get all of the details. I want to thank Jabari and I want to thank Rihanna for joining us this evening, talking about Yonder. I'm super excited to read. I love narratives with multi characters talking, so I'm just like, yes, good. It was a pleasure hearing you talk about your work, all of your upcoming books, and the process, the past, the present, the future, all that good stuff. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. I just want to say I'm always pleased to do an event at Pratt. I've done every book that I've published at Pratt, so I want to keep that streak alive.
So that means we'll see you in the future.
Yes, I hope so.
I also want to thank the Hearing and Speech Agency for signing this evening and providing accessibility to all of our viewers. So thank you.
Thank you.
And last but not least, our wonderful audience for joining us this evening virtually. If you haven't already, please pick up your copy of Yonder. Links have been posted in the chat, so there's no reason to not buy it. Go get them now. Go get it now. And with that, I'm going to sign us off for this evening. So thank you, everyone. Stay safe, take care, and have a good rest of your night.
Good night, everyone.